About 5 or 6 years ago, mini retro consoles were all the rage, especially ones from Nintendo and Sega. But it looks like Sega is officially bowing out of the console wars. Well, the mini console wars. It's the final Sunday of 2024, so you know it's got to be sensational. I'm Mike, and I'm back to talk about the gaming news for the final time this year. And speaking of final, it looks like the Genesis Mini 2 may be the final mini console that Sega releases. So back in 2016, Nintendo kind of kicked off this whole mini console thing by introducing the NES Classic, which a lot of people, including myself, kind of went crazy for. It was basically like a mini Nintendo that had a bunch of retro games built in. Plus, it was only about $60, so it was cheap enough that people were just buying them up when they saw them. Nintendo ended up doing several runs of these because they kept selling out basically as soon as they released them. Eventually, they did do a follow-up SNES Classic in 2017, and it was shortly after this that Sega was like, hey, we could do the same thing, and they released the Genesis Mini in 2018. It wasn't as popular as Nintendo's mini consoles, but it was still pretty popular. And while Nintendo stopped releasing mini consoles, Sega would release a micro version of the Game Gear, and then follow up with the Genesis Mini 2 in 2022 after the buzz of these systems had somewhat died down. It was weirdly expensive, and if you were in the US, you had to buy it on Amazon directly from Japan and have it shipped here, so I'm not sure how well that one sold. But I can understand why people would think that maybe Sega would continue making these mini retro consoles, especially since they haven't released a Sega Saturn or Dreamcast version, which were their last two consoles. While the CEO of Sega Europe and Sega America, Suji Utsumi, did an interview with The Guardian recently and confirmed that they will not be making any more mini consoles. He basically said that he loves Sega's history, but he wants to focus on the future and that they're not a mini console company. Sega is also in the process of remastering and releasing a lot of their retro games, so it makes sense that they will want to focus on that as well as new games instead of making these retro consoles. The part that I find the most interesting from this interview, though, is that Sega CEO mentioned that they're looking into doing their own subscription service, similar to something like what Ubisoft has or EA, where basically you get access to their games by paying a monthly subscription fee. They said it's something that they're thinking about and discussing, so it's not like they've confirmed that they're going to do it, but I don't know if their game library will lend itself well to having their own service. It would probably make sense for them to partner with an existing service, but let me know what you think down in the comments. But while the dreams of a new Sega mini console are dead, fret not, because, this isn't really a positive contrast like I hoped for when I planned this segue. Oh well, the dreams of a new Dead Space game are dead as well. So the creators of Dead Space were on the Dan Allen Gaming podcast recently, and they were asked about doing Dead Space 4. This probably came up because they did the remake of the original Dead Space in 2023, and it was well received, so of course people were either hoping for more remakes or even a full sequel to the original games. Well, when the creators were asked about doing a Dead Space 4 on the podcast, they said they pitched it to EA this year and they got a flat out no, that they're not interested right now. They did say that it could change in the future, as of right now a lot of companies aren't willing to take risks on games, so it's possible that when gaming revenue is booming again, that there could be a Dead Space 4. They said they basically have a story for it already, so we'll see what happens down the line, but it ain't gonna happen no time soon. Alright, it's that time of the show again where we talk about layoffs and or closures, and this week it's Hothead Games. So Hothead Games was founded in 2006. It's a Vancouver-based company, and they started with console and PC games, but primarily for the last 13 years they've been doing mobile games. So I'm not personally familiar with their game catalog, but they have been in business for a very long time. Well, they announced via LinkedIn that they are shutting down. Basically, they said they were working on a AAA game that was going to launch on mobile and PC/console. They were trying to secure contracts for each version of the game, but it took longer than expected, and then the mobile publisher ended up pulling out, and a couple of weeks later the PC/console publisher pulled out as well, and without being able to secure funding, they said that the only option they had was bankruptcy. At this time, it isn't known how many employees they have and how they'll be affected, but it seems like it was a smaller studio. But either way, I hope the affected people can find work quickly. Alright, with that bad news out of the way, it's time to predict the future. Or we're going to talk about this article's predictions of the future. Let's just go ahead and talk about it today. In our final story of 2024. So of course we're close to the end of 2024, and analysts will usually predict what trends we're going to see in each industry and do their forecasts for revenues for the upcoming year. Well, DFC Intelligence released their annual market report last week, and they had a lot of interesting predictions about gaming in 2025. So of course everyone is predicting that Nintendo will finally release their new console next year, And this analyst is predicting that Nintendo is going to be the clear winner in comparison to Microsoft and Sony. And I can see that if we're talking about console sales, since their current console, the Nintendo Switch, is one of the best-selling consoles of all time. As long as they don't Wii U themselves again, I can see their next console selling extremely well. Now, where this prediction gets kind of weird is they predict the market can't handle more than 2 major consoles, and that either Microsoft or Sony will basically exit the console business. Of course, they go on to say what everyone is thinking, that if anyone left the business, it would be Microsoft, because as they quoted in the article, Sony has a loyal base and a strong Sony IP, but they predict Microsoft will become the largest publisher, especially after they acquired Activision Blizzard. Now, other than those predictions, they're thinking that gaming revenue will recover by the end of the decade, and that 2025 will be the first year that it starts to recover. So my thoughts on this is I could see all these things happening, like Nintendo releasing a new system, and if it's a lower price alternative that can deliver on performance along with the portable aspect like the Switch did, I could see it still being the #1 selling system this generation. Now, as far as Sony or Microsoft leaving the console business, I don't think that will happen next year. But Microsoft has really been preparing themselves for a future without a console, with them focusing on streaming and subscription services, and then them bringing their games to other consoles, including the PS5. And while I like having the 3 consoles so there's more competition and more options in the market for people, if a console were to die in 2025, it probably would be the Xbox, but I don't think it'll happen next year, but it could happen eventually. But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think the Switch 2 will be the #1 console this generation? And do you think that Microsoft or Sony will leave the console business next year? Again, let me know down below, and if you enjoyed this video, then make sure to tell a friend, tell a coworker, like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell notification button thing to know when I drop a video or a live stream. And always do at least 2 things at the same time.